Welcome to everybody. If it's okay with everyone, we will be recording today's webinar. We know that there are a number of folks that weren't able to attend today, but we're very interested in the topic and we're just absolutely delighted to have Deborah Bronk, Dr. Deborah Bronk and Olivia Durham with us today. Really a topic that is near and dear to the hearts of many Mainers, which is this conversation that isn't new on the warming of the Gulf of Maine. Not being from Maine as my native state, I learned and have learned a lot around the implications of the warming of the Gulf. And so today we're absolutely delighted to have this distinguished panel. Dr. Deborah Bronk is the president and CEO of Bigelow Labs, and a new friend, I would say, within the last month. Reached out and really started to explore some collaborations between the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative as well as Bigelow Labs, which is just a gem to have hosted here in the beautiful state of Maine. And Olivia Durham, who is one of our amazing KCI youth ambassadors. I mentioned earlier, if you have been online for a couple of minutes, Olivia also was hosting a panel discussion yesterday for reviewing of the show 2040. So thanks for coming back for a second webinar this week, Olivia, and also just for your optimism and voice in this important conversation. My name is Jono Anzalone. I am the new executive director for the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative, most recent member of the team, and just delighted to be with everybody today. Come from a long background within the disaster response field and have seen the implications of climate change play out over the last 24 years of my Red Cross career, really spending lots of months and years, frankly, responding to disasters. And I'm just excited to have this dialogue. We know that there is this implication around the warming of our waters, whether it be the Gulf of Maine or other oceans of the world. And we're here today largely born out of impassioned educators, many who are on today's webinar, and really trying to change this climate conversation from the bottom up and top down, both directions, empowering high school students and college-age youth by connecting them to their local heritage, which Olivia will talk about. So the award-winning curriculum that was developed with partners at the University of New England, the RSU 21 School District and Kennebunkport Conservation Trust, along with the Gulf of Maine Institute, really led to this conversation with youth around how they could be involved in these conversations with policymakers to really have nonpartisan action and mitigation within the communities in which they live. So our goal is to really empower these voices, as you'll hear today from Olivia and partners like Bigelow, and really trying to find ways to catalyze youth action, not only here in Maine, which is the focus today, but also across the US. So real briefly, in terms of where we see the youth voices really taking place, I think this picture really talks and really tells a story about how youth coming together with policymakers, whether it be with their local planning commissions, with the business community where they live, can really have this power to influence, to listen. And we also know that youth have a way of bringing these ideas into their households with their parent or parents, and really helping to shape the dialogue around how we look at climate change and climate science, not just climate change, but the sciences themselves, which we're really excited to explore on today's webinar. One of the things that we know in terms of the concerns of youth today is that climate change is amongst the top concerns that youth have expressed over the last decade. And of course, it's a competing stage. There's pollution and racial inequality and violent crime, all the things that keep us up at night. But we know that youth are alarmingly concerned about the future in which they're going to raise their families or themselves over the next decade. So it is absolutely delightful to be here with a renowned and really pronounced scientist, Dr. Bronk, as well as Olivia, who I think are the future. And kind of framing the conversation today, for many of you that don't know, the Gulf of Maine is really this anomaly, but unfortunately part of a sample of data of oceans and bodies of water that are warming, not just the Gulf of Maine, but the Gulf of Maine itself is warming faster than 99% of the world's ocean. And as a result, there are implications that as a social scientist, I'm just now beginning to understand and appreciate in terms of the importance for us to take collective action, which you'll hear about today. One of the most powerful visuals is really this compare and contrast the last 10 years of warming within the Gulf of Maine that you can see on your screen today. And in the last 80 years, we know that we've seen accelerated warmth in the ocean and the Gulf of Maine in particular. And we know that if we don't do something in the next 80 years, much of what we know today, whether it be in Kennebunkport or surrounding areas, are going to be underwater. And this affects everybody. It doesn't discriminate based off of wealth. We do know that lower socioeconomic status communities are often harder hit because they don't have the resources to really recover or to mitigate. But we're excited to host this important conversation today, to have, again, a really established scientist within our own backyard in Maine, and also one of our youth ambassadors who not only has been part of this local dialogue within the Kennebunkport area, but also has an interesting connection that I won't reveal just yet with our wonderful, wonderful Bigelow partners. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Deborah Bronk to give us a real exciting overview of the work that's happening at Bigelow. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you. Thank you, Jono. Well, I am thrilled to be with you all today. It was, I've had a great time getting to know Jono and learning more about the organization. I'm also thrilled to be here with Julia, and you'll see why when she starts talking. So I thought because she is going to talk about the start of her career, that I would talk about the start of mine. So I'm originally from Wisconsin, but I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and both of those places are a long way from the ocean. But I was obsessed with the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, which, if you remember that show, you are dating yourself. But it really captured my imagination, and I have basically devoted my life to it. I spent every summer on a tiny little lake in the far, far northern part of Wisconsin, which looks very much like Maine, which is probably why I'm loving living here, and where I pretended to be an oceanographer. So I spent the past 30 years as a college professor and a researcher, where I led or participated in research cruises and expeditions, up to 50 of them, all around the world. The picture on the left is me on my very first research cruise, was in the Caribbean. And the picture on the right is me with my research group. We call ourselves the Nitrogen Snow Ninjas when we work in the poles, and there we are in Antarctica. I also took a leave of absence while I was a researcher and served at the National Science Foundation, which is the federal agency that funds basic research across all of the science and engineering disciplines. And there I was a director for the Division of Ocean Sciences, where I managed a budget of $356 million. I don't know my phone number in Maine yet, but I remember that number. And it was an incredible experience, and it is really that experience that led me to Bigelow. So I've been the president and CEO of Bigelow since 2018. I took a step away from research to do this, and it has just been thrilling. So Bigelow was started back in 1974, and since then it has grown into one of the top oceanographic institutes in the world. Even though it's not that big, we're only about 100 people. Because we are so focused, we've really been able to establish an area of excellence that is kind of unparalleled in this field. So we study the foundation of global ocean health, which means we've studied the microbes, the microscopic plants and animal that make up the base of the food chain in the ocean, which everything else relies on. We also study corals and kelps. These are foundational species in the environments where they live. At our heart, we are a basic research institute, so we study questions to fundamentally understand how things work. About 80% of our budget comes from grants. Most of those are from the federal government, so any taxpayers on the call, I want to say a great big thank you to all of you. But what really attracted me and why I'm so thrilled to be part of Bigelow is that we also use our discoveries to achieve the goal of improving the future for all life on our planet. And we do this by developing solutions. And this solution work is supported by some grants, but primarily through partnerships from real visionary philanthropists and donors. So we've got 3 research foci. The one I'm going to talk about today is our changing planet. So climate change threatens the ocean's ability to clean our atmosphere, to feed the growing population on the planet, and to support the global economy. And this is particularly true in a state like Maine. So some of this work is research where we're just trying to fundamentally understand how some part of the ocean works. An example of that is the Mosaic Project, which some of you might have read about in the newspaper over the last year. Mosaic is the largest international program that was devoted to studying the changing Arctic. 2 of our scientists, one is in the blue picture in the blue hat in the picture on the upper left. One spent 3 months, the other spent 6 months aboard a research vessel that was locked into an ice flow that then moved southward from the North Pole. And the goal there was to monitor all these different parts of the Arctic ecosystem that are changing. Our scientist, Steve Archer, was looking at changing gas exchange. This work is really key because if you want to understand and predict how the climate of Earth is going to change in the future, you really need to understand what's happening at the poles. But then we take what we learn in places like the Arctic and we bring it back closer to home to address climate change in real practical ways. So here's a shot of another one of our researchers who is helping kelp growers in Maine coastal waters, which are experiencing ocean acidification. So when carbon dioxide diffuses from the atmosphere into the ocean, it makes the water a little more acidic. And kelp farms are basically like giant carbon sponges. Kelp grows so fast you can almost see it. It's 2 feet a day. And when it grows, it takes up all this carbon out of the water and it reduces that acidification. And this work was a partnership with a local kelp farm and a mussel farmer. And what they showed is that if you grow these mussels within a kelp farm in these reduced acidified waters, you get thicker shells, which have less predation, and there's more meat in the mussel. So it really helps them produce a better quality product because they are kind of turning back the clock on climate change. The biggest solutions-based project we've got right now oddly involves cows, even though we are an ocean institute. We are working to develop a microalgae and seaweed-based cattle supplement to reduce methane production. So cows are the largest source of man-made methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is up to 84 times more potent in terms of warming in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. We hope to have our first product out within the year that's going to be focused on the organic dairy industry within the state of Maine. But the potential for this, all the different parts of this project are enormous in terms of reducing the amount of methane that's produced, which is something this planet definitely needs. And then embedded in all of our work are students. So Bigelow offers, I think, one of the most immersive research experiences in any ocean institute in the country. And I think part of that is because we are independent. We are not affiliated with the university. So we don't have students all around us all the time. Most of our focus is on undergrads, which come for summer and fall residence programs, and they really become part of our research teams. Many of them join research expeditions. They publish their research results in science journals. And we also have a Bloom program, Bigelow Orders of Magnitude. And this, we try to get a junior from every county in Maine to come, and they spend a week-long intensive residency at the lab. For example, in the lower left, the woman who's looking right at the camera, this is Leanne Whitney. Leanne was a Bloom student. She came back as a summer intern. She was then a postdoctoral scholar after she got her PhD at the lab, and now she's a professor at Maine Maritime Academy, and she spends her summers at Bigelow doing research. So to turn over to one of our most recent Bloom students, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia.
Thanks, Deb. And really just a quick introduction for Olivia. I know that certainly one of the draws of coming to KCI were the youth voices that really are impassioned, not only about climate change, but the ties to the scientific community. I know today we're very fortunate to have Melissa and Dr. Pam Morgan, who really were instrumental with Leah in creating this environment for youth like Olivia to really blossom their curiosity around climate action and sciences. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Olivia to share your journey and your story with us.
Hi guys, or everyone. So real quick, Jono introduced the Gulf of Maine Field Studies class earlier, but I had a fun journey there. So I was sitting in biology class my sophomore year, and I heard the list of classes that I could take next year, and one of them was this class. And it really brought me back to when I was little and everyone played in the tide pools and everyone just came together to look at the magnificent world under the sea. So I went for it and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. It really cultivated my love for science and made me realize how local these issues are. And before then, I think everyone is it's not in my backyard, therefore it's not my issue. But this class really made it so I could realize the local issues. We really started impactful projects in the class. The picture on the left of the screen in front of the bus, we started a Ride to Slow the Rise campaign, which was to try and get everyone to use the bus transportation system to help with carbon emissions when it comes to transportation. Sadly, that never got to take off because COVID hit right when we were going to debut. But it also allowed me to go into the community and do community interviews, which I think is really eye-opening, because before then, as a youth, you don't really get a voice to go out and talk to people that are older than you, or I don't know, have a higher status in our social hierarchy. But that really allowed me to see everyone's perspective, especially on a local level. It also allowed me to write a case study that revolved around sea level rise in my community and its impacts on my local beaches, which was something that really opened my eyes because, of course, I want to preserve the way that my town looks for the future generations. So, as Deb mentioned earlier, after taking that class my junior year, I found this opportunity through someone I met at a music camp. And so I said, what the heck? And I applied for it. And I was super excited when I got the email back saying that I was granted the opportunity to. So this happened over the summer. And basically it's an immersive week where you go up to Bigelow Labs, you stay on the campus, and you get to do a bunch of research. You get to go out on the research cruise, and then you get to analyze all of the data that you went out and got for yourself, kind of like what we did in the field studies class. This, other than me loving the science, it also allowed me to see a bunch of different perspectives that I really wouldn't have been exposed to if I hadn't done it. Like Deb said, they pick one person per county, or they try to. So I got to be exposed to people that I had previously just said lived way up north. So the pictures there, you can see our little group, and obviously we were all COVID tested, all tested negative, had to wear masks the whole time. So it was a super safe experience and super interesting. So with both of those experiences in mind, I started to reflect on all of the knowledge that I had previously gained. And like I said, the case study about beach erosion and specifically the seawall that's on Gooch's Beach, I don't know, any locals on here would know. And that really made me think about the implications for the future generations. And pictured on the left is my mom when she was 5 on Mother's Beach in Kennebunk, Maine here. And then on the right is myself on Parsons Beach, which is another local beach in Kennebunkport. And I just really started to think about how I wanted to allow my children to have the same experiences that I did. And really the science shows that our beaches will be gone in Kennebunk, at least. Like for any locals here, Dock Square will be completely underwater, most likely by 2100. So that really started to make me think about what can I do to help this out? Because I think a lot of people see it as such a huge issue and that they really can't do anything about it, but it's the little things that count. Like, so on the right here, I have a few things that outline what we can do. And I know everyone kind of scoffs at like metal straws and and reusable cups, and oh, it's such a millennial thing to bring your reusable straw, but it really does matter. The amount of plastic straws that litter the ocean, the amount of Starbucks coffee cups that you can see wash up on the beach, or really anywhere in our ecosystem. So I just think that those two experiences really led me to try and find things that I can do that help, which all of you can do too, which is outlined on the right. So yeah.
It's awesome, Olivia. And I forgot to mention, hopefully there are attendees that have questions for either Deb or Olivia. We do have a Q&A feature in the Zoom. In the lower center of your screen, you should see an icon that says Q&A, and you can either type in your question, or if you'd like, you can actually raise your hand as a participant, and then Megan can unmute you. The webinar feature doesn't allow for video for all of our attendees. However, we can unmute your line if you do have questions. So as we are watching for hands in the attendee queue, as well as in the Q&A feature, I'd like to just throw out a couple of questions for Deb and Olivia. I'll toss it back over to Deb, really just kind of thinking about your career as a scientist and really the experiences that you have had in your career. Climate science and climate change can often be a controversial subject. There are some that are very impassioned by it on both sides of the political aisle, so to speak. Have you found in your experience effective ways to really talk about or communicate science and climate science to the public that you'd recommend for individuals that are on this call or for others?
Yeah, so there's actually been a fair bit of research done on how to effectively communicate climate science that I wish had been done earlier. I think I've been talking about climate change issues for close to a decade, but I had to be very careful of the audience I used. And when I was in DC, we never used the term climate change because it was just considered toxic. And but what the science has shown is that people can be overwhelmed by the negative aspects of climate change, because let's be clear, it is serious, right? We should have been addressing these issues 50 years ago, and the fact that we waited so long, it is a climate crisis. But what we've learned from studies by a guy named Dale Kahan, who's at Yale, is that focusing on what people can do, focusing on hope, focusing on the positive and powerful side of science and activism is how you're going to reach people and hopefully get them to change behavior and to advocate and to think critically, especially when they vote, right? So too often, there's lots of issues that people consider in terms of who they're voting for, but how often do you see politicians today getting into, even rudimentary science conversations? It just doesn't happen. They don't have that experience. So putting it on their radar screen means they will beef up their staff, and they'll start having to learn and forming, robust opinions on climate issues because the voters are requesting it, asking it, and demanding it.
It's really helpful insight, and especially focusing on the things that we can do and the positivity that comes with it. Because I know often I keep this book that Leah lent to me on my desk, and sometimes it's overwhelming to think about the anxiety that comes with the consequences of climate change. So those tips are really helpful to hear. We do have a question, and I'll throw it over to Olivia and then Deb, if you'd like to add in as well. From Kathleen, what's your opinion of towns that repeatedly spend millions of dollars building seawalls without actually altering the locations? So when I think about this question, especially being in disaster response for so long, I would often be in parts of the Caribbean, Central South America, along the coast, that we would struggle with this because we'd see billions of dollars often poured into coastal communities for rebuilds. But curious, Olivia, as a youth voice kind of thinking about the future, like how do you view towns that are thinking about rebuilds or building seawalls without addressing the altering of locations?
So this was one of the things that I looked at specifically for that case study, because I wanted to find alternative ways other than just repeatedly patching up the seawall as, because the sea level rise, so it's going to keep getting battered down and it's going to wash over the roads and make road access terrible. And if you know Ocean Ave in Kennebunkport, having that road be down for a long amount of time is a disaster for many reasons. But so a lot of the future mitigation efforts cost a lot of money. And yes, it costs a lot of money to patch up the walls, but there needs to be some type of bridge between when you stop funding the walls and have enough money to get like larger mitigation efforts. Specifically in Kennebunkport, a couple suggestions could be living shorelines, which is basically the like cultivation of marshes, which also sequester carbon, which would help with climate change, again, like the kelp effort from Bigelow Laboratories. But so I think the money aspect is the biggest issue right now.
Those are important reflections, Olivia, especially the cost value analysis and looking at the trade-offs. Deb, any thoughts on your end?
I thought that was a great answer, Olivia. One thing that I think would help is greater transparency. If people realized how much money was going into reinforcing structures, and especially in smaller communities where, you got to start thinking of it in trade-offs, because that money's not going somewhere else, right? So greater transparency on what it costs, I think will increase the appetite for investment in developing better and doing better solutions. Like, Mother Nature is great at protecting coastlines when the coastlines aren't supposed to be moving, like on barrier islands and things like that. If you look farther down the coast, it's incredible what we have built hotels on. These are temporary islands that change on a daily basis. So would I say never reinforce a seawall? Probably not, but because there are places that are easier to protect, but then there are some places you just need to let go and look at alternative buildings, either moving, or there's also a great work being done on architecture that floats. I don't know if you've seen any, which is amazing. And it sounds bizarre, but the more I've learned about it, it's actually fairly low tech, and it just, the house will float up. And then when the water goes down, it goes back down on its solid foundation. It's incredible what engineering can do.
It is impressive. And I think in particular, this intersection of the economic value of decisions in the planning process are really valuable, along with the cultural aspects, which it's very emotional, I would imagine, for communities to undergo these conversations. Related to that, there's a great question that I'd love to throw out to both panelists. It's that individual action is meaningful, but more conversations are focusing on legislative action to steer policy and corporate accountability towards more responsible actions. However, many youth who are passionate about these issues cannot vote. So how can there be meaningful impact in promoting systematic change in these areas?
So I can take that one real quick. Yeah. It's a big question, loaded question. But I think that a big component is just being able to go out into your community and to talk with the people who can vote, and to talk with legislators, because even if you can't vote, you can still go up high in the political food chain and start talking to your state legislators, or even send letters to DC. I think that there's so many avenues that if you want to have your voice heard, your voice will be heard.
Excellent point. Deb?
I think one of my own personal goals is recently, and I'm gonna, as soon as we can start meeting in person again. I mean, I never say no if somebody asks me to give a talk. I never say no if a legislator wants to talk to me. But I oftentimes find that I am preaching to the choir, right? I'm being asked to speak to people that already understand the urgency and want to understand it better. And to do a better job of reaching out and just asking for opportunities to speak with groups that right now don't believe climate change is happening, or think it's too big of an issue that we don't want to destroy our economy in order to adjust climate change. I mean, there's all these issues that if we just would talk to each other. So one of my personal goals is to go out and speak with groups and just anybody that'll listen on these issues. And I think I have, I've got a degree, I've got an experience. I think when I am coming in the door, they have already made assumptions about me. Where I think younger people, when they come in the door, who doesn't love to listen to a young person talk with enthusiasm about the future? So I think in many ways, youth in this country are better ambassadors for these messages and this information, because they come with fewer baggage of what people think they're going to say before they even open their mouth.
I think that's brilliant. And certainly our theory of change and really activating, empowering youth voices is largely based off of many studies and bodies of literature that suggest that even middle school and high school age students that can't vote influence the decisions within their homes, right? And there was a brilliant study that we're happy to provide from Nature Climate Change back in 2019 that KCI really started to form its programming around, because they've done longitudinal studies that show that children that aren't able to vote, and then high schoolers that aren't able to vote, that bring these ideas into the home over time help to shape in a way that, again, I like the way you put it, Deb, it's without baggage.
Right.
It doesn't come with an agenda either than, I want my children to be able to play on the beach in 20 years, right?
Yep.
Really good points. There's an interesting question really around lessons learned. So from other public service campaigns that are out there, this is from our KCI and KCT ally and friend, Dave Jordan. There's the curbing smoking and litter. I remember Smokey the Bear campaign back when I was growing up. Is there anything that we've learned from those campaigns that can help us approach our work in trying to raise awareness around scientific community tied to climate change?
So I'll take a stab at this one. So I think, yes, we now know that there was an active program within many oil companies that knew what was happening, and they are scientists that worked within the oil companies, documented what was happening, that CO2 being put in the atmosphere was going to change the climate, and the strategies that they used to try to create public opinion that was pro oil was very similar to what the cigarette industry did, right? If you can't argue with the science, cast doubt on the science. So they followed the same rule book there. So on one hand, you could use that example of where big industry, in this case, the cigarette companies, really tried to confuse the issue to keep people smoking. And if we use that argument with the oil industry, we are correct in using that argument. The problem is using that argument. I think we need the oil industry is one of the organizations that, or groups of organizations that actually have the incredible resources at their disposal that could be powerful allies to reverse climate and climate change. So I hate the idea of bashing on the oil companies too much, because one, people are going to put up their, put up their walls that, wait a minute, they're not all bad. And because we need them, right? So there are some, like Exxon is investing a lot of money in biofuels. We need that kind of investment. So yes, can we learn things from that? Yes. Did they follow the same playbook as cigarettes? Yes. Do I usually bring that up? No, because I find I will alienate probably more people using that as an example as I will convince, and the oil companies are now much quieter on the issue. So it's not such a head-to-head discussion anymore. But that's a great observation.
And I think too, a big part of it is the leadership that you have in place, because if you have a leader that's backing up the science, backing up the doubt around the science, obviously most of the country is possibly going to think that that's true. And I don't know, I just think that the leadership aspect is huge when it comes to helping clarify the misconceptions around the science.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Leadership matters. And I told Olivia and the youth panel last night, in 10 years, we're all going to be working for them. Those are the future leaders, and I would gladly clock in and clock out under Olivia's leadership, running an agency somewhere someday. Speaking of leadership in the current pandemic, I think there's a brilliant question that was raised around lessons learned, picking up on the question from Dave. What have we learned from the current pandemic about how to lead through the public through a major crisis like this, through the lens of climate change? And just a little commentary, if you would have asked me 15 months ago if X percentage of the workforce would be working from home with very little social interaction with family and loved ones, I would have said, our public health systems, we're way past that. That's so 1900, early 1900s. And so really just kind of reflecting on the question in the chat box, which is around what have both of you brought in terms of learnings from the current pandemic that might be transferable to the urgency around climate change and climate action?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, there's two things immediately come to mind. One, we can see what happens when we don't have a strong national plan in place and leadership guiding us through a crisis, right? So I don't want to get into any of the politics, but the United States has handled the pandemic just about as bad as any country in the world. And normally we would be the people the world would be looking to in a science and health crisis. What is the US doing? That's what we're going to do. And we would be coming to the rescue. And instead we have just, hundreds of thousands of people have died and our economy is in shambles. So to the point before, leadership matters. And having leadership on the climate crisis is critically important to have a robust national strategy. On the flip side, I think all of us have learned that many of the carbon expensive parts of our lives are not as necessary or obligatory as we once were. Yes, my dogs are driving me a little crazy at times, but I can function very well at home. And I'm actually healthier being at home. I cook myself nice meals and exercise more. And I'm saving, well, it's a pretty short commute, but for some people, it's not a short commute. So we are rethinking, we're raising funds right now to add a fourth wing to our building. And we had a plan right before the pandemic hit. And now we are revisiting all aspects of that plan. Do we need the same office space that we thought we did? So it's causing us to rethink a lot of things. And I think everybody in this country in some way has learned something that they could give up, that they probably won't start doing again when life goes back to normal, because it's just not that necessary.
Yeah, I really think it helped show people that climate change and global warming is real, because they can see the tangible proof now the cleaner air people talk about. They're like, my cities, it looks so much nicer, the air is crisper, I don't see as much fog. And I think that it was really helpful for people to actually see like tangible proof that when we cut back on whether it's transportation, like carbon emissions from that, or any other sort of emission coming from staying in the workforce, I just think that it really helped show people the change.
No, that's brilliant. I think one reflection that I have often in the natural disaster space, when we see an imminent crisis, we activate an emergency operations center. It's all hands on deck, and really trying to view this emergency similar to other disasters, whether it be a hurricane, where it really is all hands on deck. But I like what Deb said earlier in terms of delivering hope and the messaging around the things that we can actually each do, which leads me to our last question from the audience. And then we'll queue up certainly learning more about both Bigelow as well as KCI. We have our websites for individuals to peruse if you're not familiar with our institutions. But a great question really around how do we get this message out without sounding preachy? I mean, certainly, you know, growing up as a disaster responder, my family often would say that's all you talk about is disaster. And I can imagine that loved ones, friends, donors are all looking for clever ways for us not to sound preachy in the approach. So what are the tricks and tips that you would provide, both Olivia and Deb, in terms of getting the message out but not sounding like we're lecturing?
Do you want to start, Olivia?
Sure. We actually talked a lot about this in the Gulf of Maine Field Studies class, because it's a class of youth, and it's targeted to start conversations and to go out into your community, your local legislature. But I think that for youth, it's easier to sound preachy because people kind of play it off as passionate or excitement. But I think that as long as you frame it in a way that makes it seem like it's yourself and your concern and your passion, that'll project onto the person and have them be like, oh, wow, they really do care about this issue. Maybe I should too, rather than framing it like you should care about this. These are all the reasons why you should change your lifestyle. I think rather you should focus it more on yourself to help them get the message.
Boy, that was great. That's a great answer. That's a great answer. The approach that I've taken is I try to focus on the science, and the basic science behind climate change is really simple. We've got an atmosphere. If we didn't have this atmosphere, we'd be a cold, dead rock. We are making that atmosphere thicker. It's warming up the planet. And just talking to people about that, you know, it's not complicated. We've known this since the late 1800s. We've had a journal devoted to climate change since 1977. This isn't a new fad. Scientists have been banging this gong for years. And then the second part of that is to just listen, right? Listen to what people have to say. Why don't they believe it? And you can figure out, you know, sometimes they just don't understand. Sometimes people have tried to make it a lot more complicated than it needs to be, and that just turns people off. So keep it simple, and listen a lot. Listen to what they're having to say, and in what they're telling you, try to find some connection. But don't say should. And talking about yourself, Olivia was right on the dot there. Talk about yourself and not project what you think other people need to do, and hopefully lead by example.
You're both hired as adjunct communicators for KCI, and of course Bigelow, which is probably obvious since you lead the charge there, but really want to thank you both for the incredible generous offer to host this panel and to be on the panel. And also a huge shout out, I know Melissa from RSU 21, Dr. Pam from the university, the inspiring Visions with Leah for this Gulf of Maine Field Studies vision really coming to life. I couldn't thank you three enough for bringing the vision to life, and to Bigelow for being a gem in the state of Maine. And we're just excited. I can see this beautiful graduation from like being in KCI ambassador into Bloom, we got something going here. And certainly I leave this webinar with much more optimism than I started, just remembering that optimism and hope that comes from some of these tricky conversations. So without further ado, we promised 45 minutes. I'm a minute over. I apologize, but thank you both for your generous time and for the enlightening words of wisdom.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for coming.
Bye-bye.